we're so excited. This is our first lecture for, I don't know, well, we didn't have any in
March 11th, 2020.
That's correct, because Linda and your group were the one and only lecture we had that year. So in 20, you know, it was the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which afforded women the right to vote. So that lecture series was going to be all about and given all by women. And so we had our first lecture that Linda and your group participated in, the archive collection group. Laura was a part of that. And Marlene Huffaker, Shannon DeLapp,
And Beverly Fisher.
and Beverly Fisher. And so that was the only lecture we had, because then COVID hit. So we are reprising that 2020 lecture series beginning this evening. So we're so thankful that you're all here. We're sorry that we're masked again, but we're masked, we're socially distanced, and we're safe. I hope everybody was able to get some of our refreshments. Sorry, not homemade like they have been in the past, but at least it's something to nibble on and something to drink if you would like. On your chairs are our lecture series brochures. Please take one home with you so that you know what else is coming up. It will also highlight some other additional dates. Don't forget Kunstfest. We have our second book sale that will take place here in the room for the dissemination of useful knowledge, and that's September 18th and 19th. Then Mrs. Jan Colley is going to give her talk about Frances Wright. That will be another Friends lecture here, and that date is the 12th of October. And then, fingers crossed, chili cook-off, folks. So we'll look for cook teams. If anybody's interested, let us know. And that will be on the 16th of October. And that happens to be the same weekend as Arts and Harmony. So lots of cool things going on in New Harmony on that particular day. And one last thing that's in your lecture series brochure, please feel free to join our organization. Our membership dues go toward helping the library with whatever projects our director and librarian ask for and deem to be necessary. So, all of that being said, I'm going to introduce our WMI director, Mr. Ryan Rokicki. I'm sorry, I'm Jeannie Mott.
Finally, we're back at the WMI. Thanks to the Friends for having another great lecture for us tonight. A couple new faces tonight. Again, I'm Ryan Rokicki, the director of the Working Men's Institute, and we have an absolutely amazing speaker tonight. Taylor Rokicki, no relation, is a woman of many interests. 20th century music and film, 19th century English literature, and for about the past 10 years, antique vintage typewriters and those who use them. Another one of her interests is women's history and feminism. So tonight we're bringing those two topics together. Taylor's personal history is as varied as her interests. Humboldt State University, graduate work at the University of Liverpool, that's across the pond. Teaching now at the University of Evansville and USI as a professor of English. So I'm very happy to present Taylor to the Working Men's Institute tonight. Thank you so much for being here. It's going to be a great program. Always funny, always knowledgeable, always amazing. Taylor Rokicki.
Thank you, good night. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to, live up to that. I've already turned this off and turned it on again. Hold on. You probably could hear me because I do have that I'm a teacher voice, but I will speak into this if this is a little bit more helpful. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of just start off a little bit and talk to you guys about my interests and how this kind of came to be. And then I have a little PowerPoint set up for you guys where it's got a little history or through the history of how the typewriter kind of was invented, and it simultaneously seemed to parallel the progression of the women's movement in America. So even if that's not an interesting subject, I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible. If it's not, I'll tap dance or do something in here to get your attention. Make sure nobody's falling asleep here. So just by a show of hands, how many grew up with a typewriter in their house? Yeah. All right. How many grew up or how many worked in an office that had typewriters? All right. Now watch this. How many grew up without a typewriter in their house? There we are. Hi. I'm one of them. Right? Okay, so yes, surprisingly, there is this weird cutoff in the 80s where the typewriter kind of got phased out one way, became the IBM Selectric, if anybody remembers those monsters. Yeah, especially if you had to take the course of how to learn how to use the thing. And then they kind of segued into the personal computer, and that was kind of the show of the little hands that we saw. That's what we grew up with, was this personal computer. Personally, don't tell the computer, I can't stand them. Okay? I thought the computer was the worst invention ever. It's never going to take off. I thought the same thing about the iPhone, but that's okay. All right? I could not imagine why somebody wouldn't want to get up and look up the information in a book. Surely that would not go away. All right, I liked the inconvenience of having to put a little work and effort into my knowledge. Same thing with the typewriter. All right, the typewriter does not judge you. If you misspell it, it's not going to tell you you are wrong and how to fix it. This will not get hacked. How many of you have sat there when it says wrong password and you want to throw the computer out the window? This doesn't have one, right? It's kind of nice. So that idea where the effort you put into it is what you get out of it is one of the things that drew me to this. My grandmother brought me a word processor maybe when I was about 10 years old. Scared me to death. I would turn it on and it would hum. Sounded like an airplane, and it was bright green screen. And oh. So in 2003 is when I got my first computer. I resisted until the end, let me tell you. And then I finally got one of these when I was living in Sacramento, and there's something about it. What is it? I don't know. So I got a typewriter, none of which you see here was a 1960s Smith Corona thing, and had no idea how to change the ribbon, no idea what the ribbon was looking for the return key, had no idea you had to pull a lever. It was a whole learning curve experience, but I liked that. So I got a book, watched maybe a movie or two, and all of a sudden I noticed, typewriters are kind of everywhere. And all of a sudden you start watching things and seeing things and looking on the desks in these old movies. She knows what I'm talking about. And you're going, what is that? What are they using? They're using Remington, da-da-da-da-da-da. And you go down a rabbit hole. And all of a sudden you have 50 of these things in somebody's house. It happens. So that's kind of how I fell into this. So when we were discussing what are we going to do for the 100th anniversary of women's, suffrage and, women getting the right to vote, this parallels. This is kind of interesting. So we will find out. So as I'm talking, if I start flying through these slides and I'm going a mile a minute, feel free to put up your hand and say, oh, slow down. I do talk fast. If there is a burning question that you are not going to remember at the end when I say, are there any questions? Feel free to put up a hand, stop me. I might prompt you for questions as we go, so make sure nobody's falling asleep. But that's kind of the way it goes. So please feel free to interrupt me at any time. So we are going to start. Where would women be without the vote, and where would women be without the typewriter? And that was kind of the questions that was coming up. As we were going, I will try to have as many interesting pictures as possible. I'll try to make sure everybody sees them. So this is my thesis statement. Yes, I'm a teacher, and yes, there's going to be thesis statements. Sorry. It happens. Okay, so typewriter leads to the employment and independence and the vote. So the typewriter got women out of the house and into the office, and not a factory, but an office, and that's kind of the key. Women before the 1870s were either school marms, or they were working in a button factory or a fabric factory. So how did that change where all of a sudden with the Industrial Revolution, women kind of got out of the house but actually went into an office? So this influx of financially independent women led directly to women getting the right to vote. That's my argument. So we'll see what happens. Okay, just in case. I didn't grow up with one of these things. I'm just kind of here. I look cool. Let me kind of explain. So just as the mechanical workings of it, the typewriter, each key is at an end of a little lever here. Pushing the key raises the other end of the lever. This causes the letter to be pressed against a ribbon, which is the red and black thing you see strewn everywhere. And that has ink on it. And if anybody's ever changed a ribbon, you know how much ink it has on it. Forever. All right, the letter and the ribbon are hit with enough force against the paper where the letter gets imprinted and makes a sound. That's my silent one. I probably should have put it on the one that has a nice loud snap, but you get the point. Okay, so that is kind of, this also I think has over 1,000 movable parts, so if anybody, why are they, why are they so hard to fix? That's why, because one little lever would just screw everything up. All right, the QWERTY keyboard. I heard a couple of people actually say that today. This is the same keyboard that is on your MacBook or whatever the heck you guys have, and it's still being used. So the keys are arranged this way to actually make you type slower. And it's also arranged that way so they won't jam. They will still jam, but they wouldn't jam in the way that you would if you were just flying through it. So they are arranged in a certain way, unless you're in Germany, that it will, the Y and the Z are fixed. Yeah, German always do something different. Okay, and they're arranged that way to make you type slower. So it's also noticed it spells the word typewriter on that first line. So it is said it's, people can discuss why that is, but it was for the people who were demonstrating it could just easily put the word typewriter on that first line. Maybe true, maybe not. Good story or what, either way, something to tell somebody that the one thing you remember in that lecture might be this fact. It's okay. Okay? So that is still being used today. The cool fact that some people do not know about, that according to press accounts, the person suggested that final arrangement that we are still using today was Mrs. M.A. Saunders, an early pioneer of typing. So in 1905, the Remington Typewriter Company, which was the typewriter company, kind of still is, and gave her a gold watch that was inscribed 1975 to 1905 to the pioneer typewriter operator from the pioneer manufacturer. So that's kind of one of those facts that, that is not well known, that a woman actually came up with the configuration for the keyboard itself. So before the typewriter, this is what your notebooks would look like. In the 1830s, Isaac Pitman, an Englishman, developed a new way of writing phonetically. Pitman's shorthand, for those who took stenography class. These were shapes and symbols which represented sounds and words, and when they were well practiced, you could write very quickly. The problem being you would just have notebooks filled with these obscure little squiggles, and then you would have to transcribe those then again into legible type. So it was still taking you forever to get this going. So there needed to be something, even though the shorthand was helpful, there needed to be some machine maybe to make it a little more accessible or a little faster to get those memos out and your thoughts across. So the first real typewriter. So yes, it was patented in the 1700s. If anybody wants to give me those facts, I know them. I just didn't put them here. The first actual working typewriter, the commercially successful one, was invented in 1868 by Americans Christopher Latham Scholes and Carlos Glidden. I'm going to get it. Okay, so the prototype, which was soon bought by Remington. Remington was the arms maker during the Civil War. And after the Civil War was over, they had nothing really to make anymore, and they didn't know what to do. They had these huge manufacturing places, and they didn't know what to put in them. So they were making sewing machines, and then kind of got into this new typewriter manufacturing, and it exploded. So the typewriter was called the Remington 1, good name, followed by the Remington 2, 3, 4. I have a 5 at home. This is Remington Rand when they kind of merged with the Rand Corporation in the 40s, and then they started all over again. I think it's a 1. So they kind of just started numbering them over again. So Scholes' daughter Lillian, who's seen in this picture, was the one who actually was picked to sell and explain how this thing worked that her father created. And so not only did he kind of make it for her, but she was also the one that was going to go out and show people how this huge thing worked. It was very, very difficult, and there are a couple of prototypes in museums, I believe in Wisconsin, but they're very, very complicated and very heavy. There's a couple of the prototypes up there. So Scholes and Glidden typewriter, Scholes always believed that his greatest invention would help women earn a living, and he wanted to perfect the typewriter not only to make money, but also to kind of abolish this, what he called drudgery, right? This idea of being in a factory or being at home doing just a lot of housework day in and day out. So shortly before he died, he was quoted saying, "I don't know about the world, but I feel that I've done something for women who have always had to work so hard. This will help them earn a living more easily." So it's kind of interesting that he kind of created this kind of for his daughter to have a better existence and a better future. And that's kind of the way the machine went. So women at work, a nice picture. These are the Remington 1s and 2s that you see in here, are probably about 50 pounds. You did not move them, they were not portable. By the 1870s, typewriting was being taught in schools, so the Scott Brown School in New York being one of the first institutions to offer such a course. The course was titled Typewriting with the hyphen, and they were also Remington typewriters, and the course was about $100, which is about $2,000 in today's currency, and which is a lot of money at the time. So the machine was this typing machine, and the person who was, working it was the typewriter. So it was kind of, the word typewriter then got put onto the machine and backwards and forwards with that as well. So in 1881, women have their first taste of clerical duties. In the New York, the YWCA, I made sure I got that right too. I just want to sing the song every time I see it and it screws everything up. Offered typing instruction for the first time. The class had 8 women enrolled in a 6-month class, and it had 6 Remington 2 typewriters, which you see are those heavy, huge things there. The classes were all day, and then immediately started to fill open positions that desperately needed someone to be able to operate these new machines. And so they would almost be guaranteed jobs, because all of a sudden these jobs were opening up. People would have these typewriters in their office and have no idea how to use it. So the moment they graduated, boom, they were in a job. And it went at a really fast pace. So the number of enrollment at the YWCA and women in the office just started to grow and grow at this time. Okay, so the second and third year, the class had grown, as you can see here, and women started to officially enter the workforce. Every graduate of the course went to immediately get a job, and this is a picture of the graduating class of 1883. I am assuming that frightening woman in the middle is the teacher. Yes, Laura. I'm assuming that, men too, I would assume that they would learn how to use this as well, but it is different that the ratio of men to women was that, because usually it would be flipped at the time, because professional work you would think of men, not women. So it's interesting to actually see the ratio here. That woman haunts my dreams. Okay, flooding the workforce. So in the 1880s, and the census data states that basically 5% of telegraph operators in the US were women. In 1883, estimates that 20% to 25% then were telegraph operators were women. And the same study states that young women were coming into favor with businessmen as bookkeepers, clerks, and correspondents. And the Pierce School of Numbers show that men declined from 74% in the 1890s to then 60% as the turn of the century started. And it was all kind of due to this new machine. So the flux and the change of men and women in the workforce was all because of this machine. So women started to kind of take over, and men started to kind of go into other duties at that time. And just some nice pictures of ladies with typewriters. Kind of gives me a second to take a drink while you look at the lovely ladies in the typewriters. They're what?
They're selling.
Yes, absolutely. And so, and just turn of the century pictures, it's kind of nice to see as well. So now that you got the typewriter, now you got to sell the darn thing. So here is an advertisement from the 1881 selling this new writing machine. This is one of the first times, if you look at the bottom, where every young man or woman who desires respectable employment. And this is kind of the first time that women are being marketed to on a constant basis, because they are the ones that are graduating from these courses and the ones that are able to understand what was going on. Because if you imagine, this was just foreign and frightening looking, foreign and frightening looking at that time. So they needed somebody who knew what they were doing. So this is the first time and not the last time that marketing these machines to business owners for this new women workforce. And just some more quotes, because I didn't want you to have to read the whole article. I just picked these out. So she built her business by sagacity and persistent industry. Women ordinarily make better operators and are much more satisfactory to the business houses than men. And women are more trustworthy. So just, what are you talking about? Yeah, exactly. No more questions. Yeah, so it was very odd at that time that that's how the language was, because you almost think of it opposite if you think of the 1950s in the office. So even though they made 50% less income, and still do, than their male counterparts, this was the first time that women were given income and thus given independence. And that is also the key to think. By having money in their pockets for the first time, women not only began to contribute to the economy, but also shape what was being sold and marketed to in that economy. So making way for department stores and new institutions. If anybody's watching old silent movies, all of a sudden you'd have these department stores that were being featured in the Charlie Chaplin films and things like that, because there were never department stores. And who are going to these department stores and spending money? But women, and not only married women, but independent single women, which was shocking and new at that time. So you got to show some flappers with their typewriters. I have here water breaks just in case. But yes, you got to have, somehow we're going to sell these things, but just this idea where there's a new century coming and a new type of woman coming, and she has money in her pocket and she doesn't have to be married to spend that money. And that was also a new way of thinking at that time period as well. Again, some more numbers. Geez, being an English teacher, it's amazing I'm throwing this many percentages at you. But we're just going to do the top and the bottom as far as U.S. clerical workers. We have 1870, only 2.5% were female. And then if we go all the way here to the 1930s, 53% were women. So we went from 2% at the turn of the century when this machine was starting to become everywhere. And by the 1930s, women were not only half the population, but getting into half the workforce as well. And again, some beautiful pictures from, we have, this looks like the 40s on the left and maybe the late 1800s on the right. And we had here the kind of where they would place all the women to take their tests, or there would just be these large rooms and women would sit and type and, you know, do their thing. This is from the Sears and Roebuck in Chicago. I just thought that was a neat picture. Also, for those of you who have Vietnam flashbacks about your typing courses back in the day, apparently they blindfolded you. They might still do. I knew we had to close our eyes when I did it, but this is one of the tests that they did with those huge Remington typewriters that weigh a ton. So we have here, so we kind of talked about women in the workforce. We're going to talk about every type of women in the workforce. So also the African-American workforce at that time. So why African-Americans accounted for a little over than 10% of the US population during the early 1900s. There also were 1% clerical workers throughout that period. But however, African-Americans owned their own companies, including newspapers, magazines, insurance companies, and banks. So they had people writing in those offices as well. So W.E.B. Du Bois found that nearly all black clerks worked in an establishment owned by African Americans. So all these establishments had one thing in common, which were typewriters. So white and black women can be seen here using them in the office. We have just kind of a mix of all the different colors and everybody. Dr. West kind of calls this shining light in corners that don't get seen. So it's kind of interesting that no matter what office you were in at this time period, they had typewriters and women were out of the house. So getting kind of linking to that suffragette movement, there's a couple of interesting pictures of just their typewriters. This is Sylvia Pankhurst used this typewriter in to write her book, The Suffragette Movement, an intimate account of the persons and ideals. And she also had it with her when she lived in the East End of London and took it to Ethiopia. She just traveled with it everywhere. And it wasn't, because you didn't have to plug it in, it wasn't her only typewriter, but this was most likely the one that she would have used to write editorials and, you know, write at home. And the typewriter is described as the instrument in which Sylvia broadcasted her message, which makes it invaluable. So this kind of collision between, you know, the typewriter itself and now women wanting to get out a message of, hey, we'd like to vote, amongst other things, and it kind of segued those together. I'm going to need a note card on this. All right, this portable Blickendorfer, thank you Germany again, typewriter belonged to Abigail Scott Duniway. She worked also for the suffrage movement in the 1870s. This typewriter still works, even though it's kind of funky looking. Duniway and her other, she was another activist to put and proposed amendment onto the statewide ballots in Oregon. She did it 5 times, and I just wanted to list the years so you can hear how many times this woman tried to get the right to vote. So again, in 1884, 1900, 1906, 1908, and 1912. She tried to get the voting rights amendment on there, and after the amendment passed in 1912, Dunaway was among the first women in Oregon to register to vote statewide. However, she died in 1915 and was not able to see, 5 years before Congress actually ratified the amendment to have it nationwide. But, everybody was fighting at this time for some semblance of voting. And the last one, just because I have that same type, it's not the exact same typewriter, but that same type of typewriter here tonight. So this is Maud Jameson's Corona portable typewriter. And she worked as a head clerical worker and organizer for the suffrage movement, and just because it's kind of so cool. This is what they kind of call the first rag top, and it actually folds to be a little portable case. You pick it up and you go with it. This was Hemingway's favorite typewriter, because it was just 10 pounds and you could charge it down and then kill an elephant or do whatever he was doing with it. But that's kind of interesting, and that was her kind of object of choice as well. All right, so just again, some great pictures from the suffragette movement. This is from all over the world and all over the United States, not just kind of the idea of what you would think as American suffrage. On the left, we have a French woman protesting women's right to vote. In the upper right, we have a Japanese American woman who would dress up in full geisha gear with a Japanese flag in one hand and an American flag in the other, and just basically scare people walking down the street trying to get the right, or at least the press to notice her. She was very effective. We have here a bunch of women from India trying to get the right out, and also here we have the National Baptist women. I believe they were in, I'm assuming somewhere in the South, or at least New York. It looks like New York. Trying to get this word of, we would like a voice in government, please, for years and years and years. So the NWP and the WSPU are shown here using Oliver typewriters. If you can kind of see that woman in white up there. The cool thing about the Oliver typewriter is it's this weird batwing typewriter. It weighs about 100 pounds, and it's green, and it's just so cool looking. And so to imagine this office just full of that typewriter and this little woman typing behind it cracks me up. So they used Oliver typewriters, which they would use to send out letters and memos. And through decades of hard work and numerous arrests, women finally got the right to vote after the 19th Amendment was ratified in August of 1920. And these organizations then kind of started to focus their eyes on the Equal Rights Amendment, which guaranteed in the Constitution that women could not be discriminated against because of their sex. So that's what, after we got the right to vote, that started where the eyes started to go. So just to do a little summary slide of the 1900s to the 1950s, because the 1950s is when it gets a little different. So by 1900, 77% of typists in American workforce were women. In the 1930s, the number of women and U.S. stenographers and typists accounted for 96% of the workforce, so it was dominated. By 1950, there was 18.4 million women in the labor force, and that accounted for 1/3 of total workers. So by that time, as far as getting the right to vote, being pretty much everywhere in the office and kind of dominating the office setting, and it was all due in part to their knowledge and ability behind using this machine. So we have here kind of the juxtaposition between the 1900s at the top. Just because Grace Kelly's gorgeous, you might as well put her in a picture next to a typewriter. We have Grace Kelly in the bottom with her Remington, again, that huge typewriter. But just the idea of the difference in kind of how far we've come. World War II, we're going along the timeline here for those of you keeping score chronologically. Typewriters still being kind of marketed to, we need your help as well. And then there is a change in the 1950s, the typing pool. Okay, so we have here whenever a man wanted to send a letter, or the boss wanted to send a letter or make a memo, basically a shorthand / typist, or the new word, which was secretary, which started to come up. All of a sudden, the office worker was changed to that wonderful word. And they would come into his office with a notebook and pencil in hand, and he would kind of dictate in normal speech what he wanted the letter to say. She would write it down in shorthand. We all remember shorthand. It was 20 slides ago. And then she would go and type it on her manual typewriter. So all of a sudden, we had kind of progressed this way, and now we're right back to 1830s Pitman shorthand to take dictation and notes. So it kind of went a little bit backwards in the 1950s to how long we were taking, how long it was taking to get this information out. So shorthand typing was kind of regarded as a job rather than a career, just because at this time period, girls, not women, were expected to kind of leave once they got married, or leave if they got pregnant. There was no maternity leave at that time. Sexism was kind of rife at the office as well. And as far as pictures go, we're going to see some doozies. All of a sudden, the image starts to change. Can you spot the difference? All right, so Hermes Typewriter, a great typewriter. Their slogan was beautiful, sensitive, and hardworking. Because when I think of those words, I think of a typewriter. Especially when the woman is glaring at me over it. Okay, so beautiful, sensitive, hardworking. That poor woman in the middle, I'm not even sure. And she wasn't the last. Believe me, there are thousands of these. The change continues. That's the job for me. As the secretary and the boss agree. And all of a sudden, there's that word secretary. So she's not a typewriter. She's not a typist. She's not an office worker. I was an executive assistant, which sounds so much, I got an executive assistant. No, secretary. The poor secretary with that huge typewriter. And there's another one, just because they're so much fun. All right, partners in perfection. All of a sudden, this idea of woman is perfection. Okay, so through this typewriter passed the most beautiful letters in the world. Okay, and everybody can figure out that last picture. So, what is the difference? So the 1950s and that new job title we were talking about. So with this new atomic age, the office kind of brought with it an explosion of work for women. However, instead of being typists and stenographers, the job had morphed into that term, like we said, secretary. So as the 1950s progressed, this term started to kind of denote subservience. Anybody who's ever seen Mad Men, etc., fill in the blank. Underwood kind of responded at this time with this ad. I had to put it in. A constant complaint was chipped fingernails. Ironically, I actually broke my fingernail like 3 days before I did this slide. It's a thing. It still is. So kind of what they did was twofold. One of them is kind of, I said, besides the bemused stereotype, let's kind of examine their solution. One of the solutions was to get new nail polish, the non-chipped nail polish that's still being used today, so you could type your letter without ruining your manicure, which is very important. But the other one, which was kind of interesting, is they changed the actual keys on their typewriter so you could type without chipping your nail. So, this idea of what are we going to do with this, with our workforce, and help them fix their big problem of chipped nails. It's a problem, but bring on Gloria Steinem with this. Okay, so the ERA now, like I kind of mentioned it before, that Equal Rights Amendment that kind of after the suffrage movement passed and after we got the right to vote, where do you go from there? Oh yeah, we're not protected in the Constitution. We still aren't. This didn't pass. So the ERA, women's liberation, feminism is not a dirty word. Surprise, surprise. So what is called now the second wave of feminism started in the late 1960s. So instead of making coffee at political meetings, which is a real story somebody told me, women actually took their typewriters out of the office and started to create their own space and their own voice and record their own unique experiences. So in 1971, the creation of Now, which was the ladies in the bottom, which I believe is Betty Friedan, Bella Abzug, everybody on the television at that time. In 1972, they started the debate about the ERA, which was the Equal Rights Amendment, as well as the first publication of Gloria Steinem's Ms. magazine. So that's what I wanted to kind of focus on, was women then took this machine out of the secretarial position and kind of started to create their own space and use these kind of for their own ideas as well. And women in the typewriter now were everywhere and trying to get this idea across of what they were saying. So Gloria Steinem's at the top and the ladies at the bottom, there's still more fight to be had. Also, women were using also this to create at this time period, using these machines to create. We have here Lorraine Hansberry is at the top. She wrote Raisin in the Sun. Joan Crawford from, what is it? It's not Dinner at 8. What is that movie? Grand Hotel with Lionel Barrymore and John Barrymore. She plays a stenographer, so hence the carrying around that portable typewriter with her. Just because Shirley Temple's so darn cute, I just found cute people with typewriters. We have her there. We have Agatha Christie at the bottom using her typewriter, and that's Sylvia Plath at the left. Hopefully writing something happy, though I feel like it is not. She took that machine everywhere she went. So putting it all together, just this kind of arc of the history and what was going on at the time. So the invention of the typewriter created new jobs for women and made them independent in society. And this also catapulted women into the workforce and made them strive for their rights to vote and also have their voices be heard. So though there have been a progressive and a regressive ebb and flow in the workforce, women got to where we are now by determination, adaptability, and helped communicate these thoughts into action through this machine, the typewriter. So that was my thesis. I hope I proved my point. Go vote. that was an old slide, but I'm glad it worked. So are there any questions? Yeehaw. Yes.
Which one's your favorite? Did you bring a favorite?
No, I did not. If I had to say out of this table that the 1917 one is, because it is the fact that that's over 100 years old and I could still type on it. I think it is amazing that if you look at a car from 100 years ago, there were cars 100 years ago, yes, any kind of machine that was made is not being able to be used as what these things are. You can't kill them. So yes, they will, something won't go right. Yes, you need to kind of change the ribbon and fix it, but it is amazing to me that something that old can still work. Something that Hemingway, Mark Twain typed on, things like that, are still able to be used. My favorite is a Remington Model 5. It kind of looks like that a little bit, but it has those old circular keys. And Remington, if you've ever fired a Remington gun or used a Remington machine, I mean, it is, the action on it is toot, toot, toot. You just feel like a gangbuster typing on that thing. So it's a wonderful, wonderful machine to use. Any other questions? I'm all for it. Anything? Yes?
What else are you knowledgeable in? Every talk I've heard you give has been outstanding.
Thank you. I was one of those only children that had a lot of time on their hands. Yeah, we got British literature in the 1800s, so anything British in the 1800s I'm pretty good at. My other obsession was 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s in America, so 60s social movements I get really excited about. Music from that time period. If I was given a talk on the Beatles, no problem, we'd be here for hours. So things like that. Yeah, silent movies, like Ryan said, I like to know as much as I possibly can about as much as possible. I always like to be in a room with somebody no matter their age, and if they have an interest, I want to be able to contribute at least 10%. So Alex Trebek once said, somebody gave an answer, and it was Cagney and Lacey, and he goes, "Oh, you're too young to remember that." And just if anybody said that to me, I would just be so upset. So I made sure that I was never one of those kids that they said, "You're too young to remember that." I doubt it. So that was why. So thank you, though. I appreciate that. Anything else? Yes?
What was the innovation that Emory came up with to keep us ladies from chewing our fingernails?
Oh, it was the nail polish. So it was the
nail polish.
they did two.
The rounded
They did. So they created the rounded keys and the non-chip nail polish that probably people are still using. Yes. It's a wowzers. Yes.
How many do you own, and what is your most valuable one?
Oh, valuable. Well, it's only what people will pay for it or what they think is valuable too at that. But yeah, I think the 1917 one is pretty good. This is a Corona Clipper, and it's got a cool little warplane on it, which is kind of interesting as well. And then yes, I think anything over about 50 or 60 years old, they usually go for, if you go on eBay, $300-400. I mean, we see them for $5 or $6 that just make us cry when we want to buy one. We're like, it's so pretty, but we don't have $800.
You see these pictures of sometimes they're typing with their headphones in.
Yes.
Listening to something.
Yes.
What are they listening to?
Oh, playback. So they would.
That's what they're supposed to be typing.
Yes. So if they weren't writing it, Janie.
It's called a dictaphone.
Yes. So instead of doing shorthand, you would tape your boss talking for hours and hours, then you would go back to your office and type in this.
That put an end to the shorthand.
Yeah, it was an alternative too, as well. Yes.
Are there any companies still making manual typewriters?
Yes. I think Royal. Is it Royal that came out with?
Royal's come out with a new iteration of the typewriter. There are some plastic parts though, which kind of disappoints me.
Oh yes.
But yeah, the Royal is starting to make typewriters again.
And everything is kind of going back, just from my generation, our generation, going back to like the record, anything that's kind of the analog back to it. I think there is something beautiful about the effort it takes. Because, you just put a CD in, press play, go do something. But to actually take it out, put the needle on it, and have this experience, it's the same thing. You take the paper, you roll it up, and it doesn't hum at you, it doesn't turn off, it just sits there and waits for you to think. It's a lot of writers, there's a lot of mystery writers and other writers that still use their typewriter for the last 50 years just because they want to see the mistakes. The mistakes are the best part. I mean, how many of you guys have saved something you've written, put it on a flash drive? It's somewhere, and who knows, in 50 years, the computer might not even be able to read it. I mean, we're just saving it. But Tom Hanks in the movie, what is it called? Yeah, California Typewriter, I think the library is going to have it. If anybody wants to watch a really interesting, I swear it's interesting, documentary on the typewriter, Tom Hanks is in it, it's a really, really interesting view of this machine. They talk about the process of making a mistake and keeping it, and Tom Hanks sees a letter from Noel Coward that he wrote in like the 1930s, and somebody had it on a wall. That thing lasted, almost 100 years, and somebody kept it. These things make things that last. And we're just so used to just throwing stuff away these days and just saving it on to the cloud. Don't even get me started on the cloud. When do you look at that? So it's kind of an interesting idea that way. Anything else?
Ladies and gentlemen, she's our vice president of our organization. Just in case you didn't know.
Thank you. Oh, Jeannie? Yeah. She said that I'm the vice president. Wasn't anything important.
When did they start electric?
The electric typewriter started basically in the 1950s and 60s. Those are the popular ones. I'm not a big plugger-in kind of person. This thing you can take in the desert and type on it. I love that idea. And then the IBM Selectric came out in the 1980s. That's what everyone had, that ball that you had to learn how to type with it and everything like that. And you can still buy them. Etsy is a great place if anybody wants a typewriter. I mean, just type typewriter in on Etsy and just look at the stuff that's being sold. It's kind of amazing these days. Anything else? We're good? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. We'll make one comment about the presentation. The slide where the women are being blindfolded to type. My mother was a business education teacher for about 100 years. She taught grade shorthand and she taught keyboard. And what she would do would cut out little pieces of paper and tape them on top of the keys so her students could not look. Oh, it was terrible.
Some typewriters have little key covers you put on it. Cover up the keys so you can't see them.
My mother put up those papers and it was really upsetting for a lot of the students. This is crazy.
We have a typing teacher with us this evening. She's done typing here in the Army for a number of years.
For a number of years. Is that right, Mrs. Stowe? Fred said that you taught typing here for several years at the Army School. We're getting a nod.
It was traumatizing, apparently.
Please hang out with us a little longer. We have some refreshments in the back. If you haven't been up to the museum for a while, please take a stroll.
Take some.
Around for a few more questions. If you want to get a closer look at the typewriter.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to hang around and go and hack out in the car, that's great. We have some more programs coming up. Next month, we're going to have Mike Stratuski here, the archaeologist. We're going to be talking about the Harmonist Tavern here at the New Harmony. Of course, be taking the Friends Lecture Series brochure with you. Glad to be back here in person working as a student. Hope you can keep it up.
Yeah.
Now, way to pass results for this